Hello and welcome to episode 11 of Market Values, the weekly Transfermarkt podcast that runs through all the biggest talking points in the world of football and discusses how they impact the market values of the biggest stars around the sport. I'm once again joined by my co-host Manu Veth. Manu, how are you doing? It's raining here in Scotland, if you can believe such a thing, despite the fact that it's supposed to be spring. Maybe it's a little bit better where you are in Vancouver.
Yeah, it's a beautiful sunny day on Vancouver Island, as it usually is from April to about November. Sorry, Stefan, the weather here is a little bit better than in Scotland.
I was reading over the weekend, apparently it's something that happens every year and it gets everyone really depressed, where we have like this kind of almost stormy weather in the middle of May. And it happens every year because every year everyone thinks spring or summertime's just around the corner. Then we get hit in the face with this like week and a half of rain and sleet and snow. We actually had like proper hailstones the other day in the middle of spring. But apparently it happens every year in the UK. And then we forget about it, and the next year it happens and we get upset about it all over again.
So we have this weather phenomenon on the Pacific coast in June, and it's colloquially known from British Columbia all the way down to California as Junary.
Right, perfect. Keep things nice and vague, and then you have nothing to worry about.
Yeah.
Well, we're anything but vague on this podcast. We like to get down and dirty with the details, and this week's show is no exception. We are well and truly into market value season here at Transfermarkt, and kick things off this week with the Mexico and Scottish market value updates. They're out now, today, as this podcast goes live, and we'll dive into both of those a little bit more later on the show. But Manu, before we get into the meat and bones of this week's show, there's a few things we want to break down. Number one is a big announcement. Number one's maybe a bit of a discussion. I'll jump in first with the announcement, then we can kind of roll up our sleeves and get into the discussion. And the announcement, of course, is that the Player of the Season awards are now open on Transfermarkt. So across 18 different leagues across the world, you can jump in and vote for your Player of the Season. The way it works is that we have a portal where you then jump in, and we'll leave the link underneath in the description below. How it works is that you go into the portal, you pick your league of choice, Premier League, La Liga, Bundesliga, Saudi Pro League, whatever. You pick your goalkeeper, you pick your defender, you pick your midfielder, and you pick your attacker. And then once you've picked all those players, you'll then be asked which of those players you think should be the player of the season. We do this every year. It's something that the biggest stars in the world take a lot of interest in. We've got posters, Manu, all over the office of Mbappe with his award, Messi with his award, Haaland with his award. Something that, in fact, there's a player who recently did a video, I think it was a contract renewal, and his Transfermarkt award was in the background. I wish I could remember who it was.
Lukaku.
Do you remember who it was? Was it Lukaku? Okay,
it was
there
Lukaku,
we go.
Yeah.
So they are there, and actually if you take a look at the awards, you realise they do pop up from time to time. Maybe not the Ballon d'Or, but not far off it. But unlike the Ballon d'Or, you can have your say in who wins that award, because we're Democrats over at Transfermarkt. Unlike those people over in France who run the Ballon d'Or. No, of course, I'm kidding on. But yes, you can. So if you head to Transfermarkt, it will be in the banner at the top of the page as well, where you can find it. And like I said, you'll be able to find it in the description below of this podcast, either on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, however you seem to be watching and listening to this show. And that is open until the 25th of May. So you've got 1 week, or just under 1 week, shall I say, to cast your vote. Thousands and thousands of people have already done so. So if you haven't been aware of it, do that now. And Manu, that's the big announcement. But we've also got something else to discuss. And talking about players of the year, this player in particular has won at least one. I think he's maybe won a few of them, actually, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he did win a few. He didn't win it with MLS. Of course, we do the Player of the Season vote in December, because it still is on the annual league schedule until the end of the season, and then it's going to switch to the European schedule, which means then, of course, next year you'll be able to vote on your MLS Player of the Season at this time of the year. But Messi won it last year. Didn't win it this season. Heung-min Son got the award. But yeah, Lionel Messi is the player we're going to discuss. It's an interesting one because on June 2nd, we do the Major League Soccer market value update. Also, maybe also to shed some light on this, Stefan, the reason why we have so many market value updates now and why they feel compact is because we try to put them all in before the World Cup kicks off on June 3rd. And so that is why you have an enormous volume of market value updates. MLS is on June 2nd. And the biggest star of MLS is expected to go to the World Cup. I think it's about 90% certain that he will be there, Lionel Messi. And there's been quite a bit of debate of what his market value, what we should do with it in the forum. Benesis writes, and given his advanced age, the league he plays in, Messi is bound to see his value decline. It is highly unlikely that the market value of a 38-year-old player increase or remain the same from this point onwards. For this reason, I believe Messi's value will decline. He said 12 million euros, and then Anonym writes underneath, I totally agree, and he put it down as 10 million euros. And then Tar Hauster writes, current estimation 18 million, although he's quite old, he hasn't performed too badly this season. I can say one thing for certain, Stefan, that his market value will not go up. Messi might be amazing, but I don't think something extraordinary has to happen for any player over 30 to see his market value go up. I think the only one I remember in recent years was Karim Benzema when he won the Golden Boot in the Champions League, and then also won the Ballon d'Or. He was one of these very rare occasions where we said, okay, he'll get a market value increase. But he was also 5 years younger than Messi is today. Just to put that in perspective, right? I can say with some certainty that Lionel Messi will not get a market value increase. I have some thoughts on what is going to happen with his market value ahead of the World Cup, but I think it is an interesting debate on whether he will get a drop or not.
Yeah, I think it's going to be so interesting with Messi because, as you said, if there's one player that can kind of defy gravity, it is Messi. Yeah. And, he's obviously done very well in MLS. His numbers are pretty solid. He certainly doesn't look like he's slowing down if you look at the kind of goals and assists he's scoring in MLS. But equally, if you look at his numbers for Argentina, they're also quite impressive as well. And he's obviously kind of waiting to see how he does at the World Cup for Argentina. So, yeah, it's not so much whether his market value should go up or down, because as you said, it's not going to go up just because of his age, but it's really how slowly it can fall. It's basically how much he can hold off on that. It's such an interesting kind of conundrum for us here at Transfermarkt when we are doing market values, because obviously older players don't gather as much interest or garner as much transfer fees. Although, as someone points out in the forum, as you said, he's currently got a market value of 15 million euros. If he was interested, a number of European clubs would happily pay that, if not more, just to say that Lionel Messi has played for their club. Obviously, there's a whole caravan of cash that would have to follow that in terms of his wages and, marketing and commercial revenues and things like that, et cetera, which obviously, he has those deals with Inter Miami and MLS and even Apple TV, it would seem. Mm-hmm. So, not just really any club can just go out and spend 15 million euros and get Lionel Messi. But I think it's going to be really fascinating to see what happens with market value and what users think should happen, as you said. And they can do that by jumping into the market value forum. But I suspect, Manu, there'll be a lot of discussions between now and when that market value gets updated.
Yeah, I mean, it is something that we have discussed internally. I'm not going to give away where we are standing with it. I personally think where we are right now, I feel quite comfortable, but I also think it will very much depend on what his decision is going to be in regards to the World Cup. I think obviously the World Cup being in the United States, there's a lot of interest in him being not only a player who plays in the United States and represents the football club that is probably the most in the news, the American-based football club that is most in the news, in Inter Miami, right? Because of the star lure, the ownership of David Beckham and all that sort of stuff. And remember the lengths that FIFA went to ensure that Inter Miami were at the Club World Cup last summer. I think you can argue that that was maybe unfair. I personally think it was, but it's a totally different debate. There is definitely, that shows you how important it is for the people that are trying to orchestrate the biggest money grab in world history to have Lionel Messi there, right? And that shows his market value as well. And I also need to point out his salary. The MLSPA, and we have this article up on Transfermarkt, released the salaries, the official salaries of players that play in MLS. These are real hard money, like real salaries. They're not the sort of speculation that you find on certain outlets. It's quite transparent. And I have to add, this is, of course, without bonuses that he might get through Adidas and Apple TV and all that sort of stuff. His salary with Inter Miami is 28.33 million guaranteed. And there is teams that have a smaller budget than MLS than that in terms of salary. And so I think these are factors that you also have to put into his market value, right? He earns a significant amount of money. Let's say he was to be on the market, Saudi Arabia would probably pay whatever it takes to get him, right? And they would probably triple that official salary easily.
Yeah, exactly. So it makes his market value analysis even harder for sure. And there's obviously another player who plays in Saudi Arabia on the other side of the world who also tends to be very complicated when it comes to his market value. But Manu, we'll just have to wait and see. But as you said, if you are interested in taking part in a debate, head to Transfermarkt, click on forums, head to market value analysis, and then search for Lionel Messi, and you'll see that's where everyone is currently discussing his market value. And you can, of course, vote in there on his market value, or you can just go to his profile page and vote there. Down the right hand side there's a little widget where you can obviously just make a quick vote back and forth there. But Manu, we have to,
or any other MLS player, really.
Of course, you can spend your whole day there in MLS, fill your boots, as we say. But we do have to move on with the show. As I said, Manu, we got down into the details with the Scottish Premiership and the Mexican top flight. You obviously spoke to our colleague Osvaldo in Mexico. Really, really interesting discussion on some of the key players who are coming through there. Mexican football maybe struggles to develop key players. The money in Mexican football is maybe holding back players and player development, which I found fascinating. And then, of course, I spoke to Ewan about the Scottish Premiership, which wrapped up at the weekend there in dramatic fashion. Unfortunately for neutrals around the world, Hearts weren't able to do it. But that didn't stop us having a really interesting discussion about 5 key players who've gone from strength to strength this season and are likely to move on for big money moves this summer. But Manu, before we get into all of that, we called up our good friend Joe Krishnan, who is our resident Chelsea watcher at Transfermarkt. He watches them more than anyone else, and he was swinging from the chandeliers this weekend when Xabi Alonso was announced as the new Chelsea manager. This has huge ramifications, not only for the Premier League, but I suspect for the market value, the transfer market in general this summer. So let's kick off with his chat right now. Before we crack on with any of the market value discussion in Scotland and Mexico, we had to deal with some very big news in London. That was, of course, the news that Xabi Alonso will be appointed as Chelsea's new manager on a 4-year deal this summer, towards the end of the season, the start of next season. Whatever way this summer he's taken over at Stamford Bridge. And as such, we had to get Joe Krishnan back on the show. Joe's obviously a part of our English team. He watches Chelsea religiously, more than anyone else at Transfermarkt for sure. Joe, obviously need to ask you about your instant reaction to the Xabi Alonso story, but I feel like we have to give ourselves a pat in the back here, because last time we had you on the show, you and I had a pretty detailed discussion about how Chelsea maybe have to take a different approach to things after a disastrous season. And I think we can safely say the bigwigs at Stamford Bridge were clearly listening to that show, because Xabi Alonso feels like a slightly different tactic or approach to how the current owners and people that run the club have been doing things, since they came in, I suppose.
Yeah. This is definitely a shift in the strategy at Chelsea. And I think, the owners have had that period of reflection where they realise that things have gone wrong. This season particularly, but obviously in the past as well. And a lot of it's come down to the managerial appointments, but obviously the recruitment is a big part of that. And I think it's a really exciting appointment for Chelsea, first of all. And I think actually, in the grand scheme of things, it's actually the best they could have done right now in terms of the available candidates. We know, obviously, they interviewed Andoni Iraola, spoke to Oliver Glasner as well. But I think Alonso brings that respect and pedigree from his playing career, which other players will resonate with in terms of picking Chelsea as their next club. As you say, there's been a shift in perhaps the role that Alonso is going to have as a manager rather than a head coach. So he's going to be more involved in the transfers and recruitment. And I think that can only be a good thing for Chelsea because, the young player targeting hasn't quite worked out I wouldn't say it's been a complete failure. You look at Cole Palmer and Esteval, for example, but there's a definite need to get more experience, and also players at the highest level in a Chelsea to truly contend at the top, with Arsenal, Manchester City, Liverpool, and even Manchester United now. So,
yeah, it's a really, really interesting one, and almost a degree of kind of managerial kind of merry-go-round, because you've got Alonso going to Chelsea, Maresca potentially then going to Manchester City, the former Chelsea head coach. Areola apparently going off to Bayer Leverkusen, I've heard. It's nothing confirmed there by any means, but that's the news today. So yeah, lots of moving parts there. But as you said, I think fair to say quite a few people surprised. I mean, I think a lot of people maybe thought Alonso was biding his time to see what happened at Anfield with Arne Slot, and perhaps even what was happening to Pep Guardiola at Manchester City. But he's decided to move on to Chelsea. And as you point out, really importantly, if you read between the lines, or read the lines themselves, I suppose, in the press release, he has been appointed as the manager, not the head coach. And we have to maybe point out for people whose English isn't their first language, perhaps, or people who aren't, as well versed in the inside baseball, football that we are, but that typically means he plays a role in transfer policy as opposed to a head coach who just picks a squad that he's given from the recruitment team. And that is kind of the crux of what we wanted to talk about here, isn't it? Because you obviously watched a lot of Alonso at Real Madrid. You covered a lot of Spanish football as well. I dealt with a lot of him at Bayer Leverkusen. I actually interviewed him for Transfermarkt when he was at Leverkusen. And I think interestingly, when you look at Leverkusen's strategy when Alonso came in, they were a club who were very famous for developing young players and selling them on. Heung-min Son, Havertz, countless others. Obviously, Florian Wirtz is a good example as well. And then you look at the players that they signed when Alonso first comes in. They've obviously still have younger players. You have Nathan Tella, Victor Boniface, Granit Xhaka, Jonas Hoffman, Alejandro Grimaldo. These are all older senior players who are there to win things. The second season as well, Alex Garcia, Martin Terrier, Buendias to an extent as well. Now, some of those players didn't work out and some of them worked out really, really well, but it was a very different shift in Leverkusen's transfer strategy when Alonso came in. It was very much a case of saying, I'm not here to stay for 5 or 6 years. I'm here to win something, prove that I'm a good head coach, and I'm going to do that with ready-made players. And I think that, Joe, is what's so interesting about him showing up at Chelsea now, because while Chelsea, I don't think we could say Chelsea are the Bayer Leverkusen of the Premier League by any means, but they have followed a similar strategy under the current owners of hoovering up young players, developing them, keeping the good ones, as you say, with Palmer, Esteval, but then looking to kind of farm, if you will, the younger ones off, or the lesser ones off to either their sister clubs or to other clubs to sell for profit. Do you think Alonso coming in is maybe a sign that might change?
It's difficult to say at this point, but I would say that the fact that Alonso has made it almost like a requirement to have that input on transfers and not just let the sporting directors run roughshod in the transfer market is quite important, because already he has more influence than Graham Potter, Mauricio Pochettino, Maresca, and also Liam Rosenior. I mean, he did have that brief January window, but he basically had to work with the squad he had. But we're hearing that Alonso wants mentality monsters from some reports, and I think that's kind of similar to what Mikel Arteta has done at Arsenal. It's not. I don't think Arteta, for example, has recruited young players, but they're sort of 23, 24, already established, already very experienced, with room to grow. And I think that's what Alonso will be looking for in terms of, he's not going to be signing 34-year-olds for Chelsea, or if he does, it would be maybe one player who's of that kind of 30 age to provide a bit of experience and leadership at the back. But you look at Leverkusen when he had the captain was the goalkeeper, Patrick, if I'm pronouncing it right.
Herdecke, yeah.
Yeah, so he obviously sees that role as a goalkeeper is very important, also involved in possession as well, but having someone at the back providing leadership is incredibly important. That's why I think Chelsea could go for maybe an older goalkeeper to provide some know-how for the younger ones. I mean, we've got Nick Plender's coming back from Strasbourg next season, and there's high hopes to him, but throwing him in at the deep end would be quite too fast. He's only 20 years old. And then you look at the defenders, the recruitment. Then Chelsea have signed Yoel Pato, Benoit Badiashile, so Disassi. They're all quite young. I think that the next signing they're going to make is not necessarily an old player, but someone that's got Premier League know-how. So maybe someone like Marcos Senesi, Murillo, Lacroix from Crystal Palace, that will not only bolster the Chelsea back line, but also provide that leadership and help them form a bit more of a solid base. And yet, obviously, we know about Alonso, his favourite setup with the back three. I think it's like 4 behind the striker. Is that right? Like 2 centre midfielders, a couple of number 10s behind the striker. I think that's really going to benefit this Chelsea team, allow them to express themselves a bit more freely. Especially you look at Palmer. When you give him the ball and he's confident, there's not many better players in that position. And I think you mentioned about the experience of some players that he brought in, Xhaka, Grimaldo. It's more important than ever that Chelsea hang on to those players that they've had for 3 or 4 years and help Alonso build that squad. And I think one of those players could be like Marc Cucurella. He's been there for Chelsea for 4 years now, 28 years old, I think, on his next birthday. He could easily fill in that role that Grimaldo had, as an attacking wing back. We saw it in the FA Cup match in the semi-final, but also the final. There's a lot of things that I like that Alonso has done at Leverkusen, and I think it has been the blend of youth and experience. You had Florian Wirtz, who really, really shone under him, and Victor Boniface. So, yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how he uses this first summer to build his Chelsea team. I think the important thing is you don't just bring in 9 or 10 signings, but maybe 3 or 4 that the team really need.
I was just thinking, as you mentioned there, they shouldn't be signing any 34-year-olds, but I was kind of daydreaming about the idea of maybe Grimaldo on one wing, Carvajal on the other. He's obviously leaving Real Madrid, former Alonso teammate, I'm almost certain, or former Leverkusen player as well. That would be quite the audacious move. But I think it's really interesting. I think when you look at the Chelsea players and you look at how their market value has changed since they joined Chelsea, I think there's an interesting kind of contrast between the two. If you look at the bottom, the players who lost the most market value, obviously Mudrik's at the bottom because of his off-field stuff, but then it's Romeo Lavia, it's Benoit Badiashile, Jamie Gittins, Wesley Fofana, Liam Delap, Garnacho, Jorgensen, Sugio, the defence midfielder. They're all players who have lost market value since joining Chelsea, and I know for a fact, and you know for a fact, that some of those players are going to lose more in this market value update. All very young players, untested, maybe thrown in the deep end if you want to be polite, but undoubtedly kind of transfer projects that haven't worked out. Then you look at the players who've gained the most market value during their time at Chelsea, and it's Cole Palmer, it's Reece James, it's Chalobah, Enzo Fernandez, Moises Caicedo. It's those kind of senior big players that you mentioned that the club really have to hold on to. So do you think with bringing in Alonso and maybe this push to more of a short-term approach to squad building, it's not really just about signing older players, but perhaps it's also about convincing those players we just mentioned there, those key players, to stay? Because last time we had you on the show, we were talking about the likes of Fernandez, Caicedo, and even Cole Palmer potentially leaving this summer, and Cucurella as well, of course.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. Obviously you have to kind of prove to the likes of Enzo Fernandez, who want to see some ambition shown by the club, in order for them to stay. Moises Caicedo, that they want to play with the best players. And okay, Barcelona, Real Madrid, PSG, they have stars in their squad. And you can see the appeal of wanting to play there, but they bought into the Chelsea project. They want to see progress. And I think the best way to do that is to convince a few players. I'm not going to suggest that Chelsea will go and sign Kvaratskhelia, for example, because why would you go from PSG to Chelsea at this point, and when Chelsea have been in disarray? But if you can use Alonso and his pedigree to kind of attract those names, it will definitely have an effect on the rest of the squad. in terms of the competitiveness amongst them as well. So you mentioned obviously Gittins and Garnacho. These are two players that were signed by the sporting directors knowing that they weren't going to be starters, but they could fight for their place in the team. They just haven't shown enough to earn that place in the team. So if you were to sign, let's say, Kenan Yildiz, who has been linked with Chelsea, Arsenal and whatnot, that's an immediate, how should I say, a call for them to improve. And it's an example for them to try and aspire to. And they haven't really reached those levels at Chelsea yet. I don't think I think it's too early maybe to call time on their careers as such at the club. You know, they will be itching to prove that they got what it takes to play in an Alonso team. So that kind of appointment, perhaps you could say the players weren't motivated by Liam Rosenior's arrival as such. But, you know, Alonso, every player wants to play for that guy. Everyone wants to be part of that exciting project. And I think that you were mentioning obviously the squad values. Obviously with players like Lavia, it's to do with injuries, but there's definitely been a number of Chelsea players who have not performed on the pitch, and that's why their value's gone down. But then you look at João Pedro, just comes straight in from Brighton, got his head down, worked very hard. I mean, the fans really appreciate that. He's been named player of the season today. So that's an example of what can happen when the club are in disarray. What about when things are going right on the pitch? We could have a team that could be ready to dominate for 2 or 3 years with just a few signings. If things go right, of course. I'm not going to get ahead of myself there, but I do genuinely believe that this is a step in the right direction, not just for project and developing those players, but also attracting better players to Chelsea to improve the squad as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked about how Alonso can improve Chelsea, but let's finish up on maybe what Chelsea can do to help Alonso, because we could talk until the cows come home about what he achieved at Leverkusen, but he was unceremoniously chewed up and spat out at Real Madrid. Some suggestions from key players, such as Kylian Mbappe, that was the wrong decision. And I'm sure if there's any Real Madrid fans listening to this or watching this, they can debate it in the comments below. But I think it's safe to say that Alonso maybe had to bounce back quickly and bounce back smartly. And some will argue, Joe, that Chelsea is maybe an unnecessary risk for him at this stage in his managerial career. But do you think this appointment in this project for him could prove to be quite pivotal for him, as opposed to, you know, for example, holding out for a job at Liverpool?
It's a crucial moment in his career for sure. I feel like he was unfairly booted out at Madrid, and it's always player politics, isn't it? You know, he had that small disagreement with Vinicius Jr. And when you take on a player of that kind of power at Madrid, or you know, someone like Mbappe, obviously that didn't work out very well for Arbeloa. So, but you look at his record at Madrid: 14 wins out of 19 in La Liga. So that's 2.37 points a game. And likewise, he had 2.14 PPG in his 140 games at Leverkusen. So we're talking about a manager who's proven he can get results on the pitch. So obviously for Chelsea, that's a huge bonus because we've not had a manager of that kind of pedigree for a long time. I think since maybe Tuchel or Conte. But Alonso does need to repair his reputation slightly because there were doubts after the Madrid project ended so abruptly. I think it's almost a win-win for him because if he can turn this Chelsea team into contenders, you know, he's done what Pochettino for a very short time, Tuchel couldn't do. Maresca obviously went off after a successful first season, and obviously Rosenior's 3-month tenure. But, you know, if he can be the man that turned Chelsea around, bigger clubs, the PSG or Bayern Munich would be looking at that and saying, well, you know, he's turned around a failing project. If it does go south quite quickly, I think there will also be a recognition that the board have their role to play because that's been the case with all the managers that have been at Chelsea so far. So obviously for Alonso, if he gets the players he wants and he's involved in those transfers and it still doesn't quite work out for him, then yeah, his reputation is going to take a hit. But I think at this point, it's almost like a marriage of convenience for the two. I'm excited to see how it works out, of course. And I think this appointment is going to restore at least some faith with the fans, but also command the players' respect. So it's going to be very interesting to see how Alonso hits the ground running in pre-season, which players he signs, which players he can improve at Chelsea, and how they fit into that system. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who are very intrigued by this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think interesting is as a small way to put it, to be honest. I think over the last couple of years, whenever Chelsea have opened their checkbook, the rest of the world has held their breath. And, we are Transfermarkt. At the end of the day, we do focus on the transfer market, and Chelsea have been the biggest player in that space for quite some time now. So, yeah, I think this is going to be an appointment. It's going to have huge ramifications, not only at Chelsea, but the rest of European football. And as such, it was great to have you on the show, Joe. And I'm sure we'll have you back on soon when we get to see Alonso and that backroom staff at Chelsea start making some moves. But for now, I'll say thanks, and we'll speak to you soon.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And I'm now joined by Osvaldo Camacho, our area manager in Mexico. Osvaldo, how's it going, buddy?
Hey, Manuel, thank you very much for having us in your program. We are already fans of our Market Value podcast, so it's an honor to be here to talk about market value updates in Mexico that we recently had.
Yeah, today, actually, as the show comes out on a Wednesday, the market value update was today. Talking about that market value update in particular, having the list in front of me, there's almost no changes at the very top. Before we wanted to talk about one player in particular, a super talent, a wonderkind that you should really know about. But before we talk about him, Osvaldo, what's up? Why is there no changes?
Yeah, there are not that much changes in the top because, as you know, we had the intermediate market value update at the end of March. So it's been just a couple of weeks, some weeks after the last update, where we had like some important upgrades, as you know, for example, like Armando Gonzalez, who is right now the most valuable player in the Liga MX. And we also had some changes with some specific stars, such as Marcel Ruiz. We also had some changes in some players from America, from the biggest teams, Monterrey, Tigres as well. So right now, we were focused more in changing the other players that maybe they didn't receive changes or downgrades during the last market value update.
Yeah, no, it's always really fascinating seeing the approach. And I mean, I need to also stress this is we're doing all the market value updates at an accelerated pace because the World Cup starts on June 13th.
Exactly.
So we're usually in a normal post-season, we take our time. We do these into June. We can't do that. They don't have, when there's a big tournament, we have to accelerate the big leagues because we want to give players a market value before the tournament, and then we're doing it again after the tournament, if applicable, right? So
exactly,
this is why you're going to see a lot of market value updates in the next 2 weeks. And of course, you are one of the first ones. The one that stands out to me, speaking about the World Cup, so not that many changes, and I urge everyone to read about the market value update on our site. There's more analysis from you as well, Osvaldo. I wrote the text in English, and you provided some fantastic quotes on some of the particular players that we're probably not going to mention, but are important. So if you're interested in them, read the article. But the name that always stands out to me is 17-year-old Gilberto Mora from Tijuana. Enormous talent. And he remains unchanged. There's some good reasons for that, right, Osvaldo?
Exactly, Manuel. As you know, Gilberto Mora suffered pubalgia. That is maybe one of the toughest injuries for players because he was like being very careful with his injury. He decided to take physical therapy instead of a surgery to being very focused in the World Cup. And he's already with the national team. But as you know, he didn't play that much in Tijuana over the last weeks and over the last months. And that's why we decided to maybe keep his value in the same level, because we are about to see the best of him during the World Cup. As you know, he has been developing pretty well. His performance during the World Cup, that was the last success of the Mexican national team, was pretty impressive. He was one of the best players in the last World Cup of Mexico. Javier Aguirre has already trusted on him because he shows different skills. He's a very mature player. Besides, he has already 70 years old. And as you know, he's very well represented. So we expect them to be maybe outside of Mexico once he turns 18 years old.
Yeah, Rafaela Pimenta
Exactly.
is the agent, of course, Mino Raiola's successor. If you are not aware. So, yeah, very well represented is an understatement in this case. I think whenever Rafaela Pimenta has her fingers in the game, you know that you have a big talent at your hands. I find him really fascinating. First of all, when there is big talents coming out of Mexico, they are usually with one of the big clubs, right? Chivas, Club America, Monterrey. Those are or Tigres as well. Those are the teams that come in mind. Tijuana, I mean, just across the border from San Diego, that's not necessarily it should be a hotbed. It's a big population there, right? And it reaches into California, and their recruitment certainly reaches across the border as well. But it's not traditionally where we've seen big talents come from.
Yeah. Maybe not in the past, but right now Tijuana actually is one of the teams that are pushing more the young talent with Sebastián Abreu, that is his coach right now. He is making a very good work. And actually, besides they weren't qualified to the playoffs, they played pretty well and actually better than expected. And they have also other figures that can be in the spotlight pretty soon.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting development. What do you think is the pressure on young Mora? Because when I think back about Mexican football, and we get to the troubles of the World Cup in a moment here, there have been big stars, right? Like Chicharito comes to mind. Hirving Lozano was a big star in Europe. He's having issues just across the border from where Mora is playing in San Diego, where he's currently suspended despite receiving a salary of over $9 million a year, which I would be sitting out that too if I was him. Fair enough. He comes to mind, and Alvarez is playing in Europe. He hasn't really come fully through. Mexican football, despite the enormous population and having produced some significant talents, has never produced a megastar who could also reflect that performance consistently on the pitch. Why do you think that is? And what does that mean for Mora's career going forward?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question because it has a lot of possible responses or answers. But I think I'm going to summarize it in two maybe main points. One of them it's the market of the Mexican league. As you know, most of the teams have a lot of money to pay a lot of money for biggest stars. For example, I'm going to put a name on here that is Chiquete Orozco. He's a defender from Cruz Azul that he was he was watched for Anderlecht from Belgium, and Anderlecht wanted to offer around of 3 million euros for him. Chivas said no because Cruz Azul offered $11 million for him, and now he's playing for Cruz Azul as well. So the moment of Chiquete Orozco is not the best one. He's actually injured, and he's maybe not going to Europe in the next years. And I think that's a big problem in the Mexican league because most of the teams have the budget and the investment to hire or sign new players, Mexican players as well, but they usually keep them for a long term. And maybe when they turn around of 27 or 28 years, like Alexis Vega, for example, they are in their prime, but any team of Europe don't want to pay that amount for them because it seems like very expensive to pay maybe 10 millions for a player that just turned 28 years old. So I think that's one of the biggest points. But besides that, also, we don't generate that much people because we have a lot of foreigners in our league. But I think that is changing over the last years. As you know, we implemented in the Mexican league a new rule of giving some minutes, around 1,000 minutes to players under 23 years old. So since that rule started in the Mexican league, we started to see some stars, actually a big star like Marcel Ruiz, like for example Gilberto Mora, Ociel Herrera, and other stars, for example from Chivas. Chivas, that's the only choice that they can take. They only play with Mexican players. But since that moment, they started to also improve the way that they develop young talents. So I think those are the main topics, but we also can discuss about that we don't have relegation, that we don't have promotion. I totally understand that, for example, in the MLS works like in a similar way. But I think the difference in the MLS and the Mexican League is that most of the teams of the United States are very transparent with their numbers. And in Mexico, they aren't, because actually we just a few months ago, we received an offer from an investor group that wanted to join to the Mexican League and invest in every team. But one of the conditions was that every team had to share their numbers, and most of them didn't want to do that. So I think we have many issues, but the main issues that we can identify that are, maybe stopping the development of the Mexican League are the transparency, that we need to push more talents, but I think this rule of minutes are helping a lot of that, and that we have a lot of foreigners and we don't have promotion or relegation.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this quite a bit lately too, that even clubs like Chivas, they recruit Americans with Mexican passports, right? Because Chivas is not the same as Athletic Bilbao, but a similar idea that you have to have a Mexican passport to play for Chivas. But they replied more loosely, you can be an American, but if you have a Mexican passport, you're still okay.
That's enough. Yeah, because it was very difficult to find talents just in Mexico, and they are also trying to find people in other countries, for example, in Europe as well. And this is not just like a strategy from Chivas, because it's also a strategy of the Mexican national team. Andres Ligini is pushing a lot this strategy to try to identify some profiles, for example, in France, some profiles in Portugal, and other kind of players that maybe have, relation with the Mexican, maybe culture, maybe with their family or other type of relation. But I think right now the strategy is to try to look in other leagues to find Mexican people or Mexican related people and try to bring them to Mexico, maybe for the national team or also to Chivas, for example.
You know, it's so crazy to me because Mexico is a country of 133 million people.
Yeah.
I look at the World Cup standings. We have on Transfermarkt, we have a table with the all-time World Cup standings. So like, this is if it was a league table, right? And you take the overall points that teams have could earn. So 3 points for a win, a point for a draw, no points if you're defeated. Mexico are 12th in that table. That sounds good. But they've also played some of the most games. They've played 60 games. When you look at it, Netherlands are in front of them with just 55, Uruguay in front of them with 59, Sweden are in front of Mexico with 52, Belgium are in front of them in the all-time standing with 51 games, and just behind them and catching up is Portugal with just 35 games. Mexico have played, as I said, the 60 games. They've won just 17 of them, drawn 15 and lost 28, and have a goal differential. And this is by far the worst goal differential of any teams on the table. You have to go actually all the way down. Oh my God. They actually have the worst goal differential period in all of World Cup history, minus 39 goals. That is crazy. It's a country of 133 million people. It's one of the most football mad countries in the world. And the World Cup record is kind of bad. And I never really understood that because I live in North America. Liga MX is the most watched league in North America, period. It's more watched than MLS and the Premier League even. And so you have a strong league, you have a big population base, and yet the results at the World Cup have been abysmal. And that brings me back to Gilberto Mora. Now you're the super talent emerging onto the scene. I mean, the pressure must be just incredibly immense.
Yeah. Yeah, Gilberto Mora actually had a lot of pressure because we are like pushing all the expectations of the future of Mexican League on him. But at the same time, I think that we are watching other stars becoming, better profiles for the future, like the Chivas ones. As you said, for example, we have Brian Gutierrez that we just saw playing against Portugal and Belgium, like in a very different way. He showed very interesting skills. He never lost the ball. So I think that one is a profile very interesting. And we have some other from Chivas, some other from Pachuca. And I think the future looks more promising, not just because of Gilberto Mora, but also because of these stars, because these stars are going to be pushed also by some by an special person that also has experience on this, that it's Rafa Marquez. As you know, he's very well experienced developing young stars, as he did in the Masia over the last years. And right now, he's going to take this process for the next 4 years. He has already signed with the Mexican national team to the process from here until 2030. So I think that it's going to be a very good chance for us to develop finally young talents that are just starting from now, playing in the national team, and that they are going to have continuity over the last years. But I think that, as you said, we are definitely in a comfort zone as a country because, I have talked about this with some colleagues from Argentina, some colleagues from Colombia, and they don't have the installations that we have in every club. For example, they don't have the budget that every club in Mexico has. So I think that's why their players decided to jump immediately after a few seasons to Europe or other leagues because they can receive more money. But in difference to Mexico, some players earn more money in here. Instead, if they decide to go to Europe. So just like the example of Chiquete Orozco. So I think that's that's the biggest challenge because they have all the conditions to stay here. Because if they want, they can sign with Monterrey, for example. They can sign with Tigres, that they have the best conditions in their training zones, in their stadiums. So that's a difficult thing because they don't jump because they are in their comfort zone. So when we have this special type of players like Gilberto Mora, we really try to push him like very out of here and very out of Mexico because actually this has been a conversation around the league because everyone says, let's hope Monterrey don't offer like 18 millions for Gilberto Mora because maybe they can take it. Rafaela Pimienta already said that she expects at least 18 million for each leg of Gilberto Mora. So I think that's going to be very difficult in the European leagues because he hasn't proved that much until now. But maybe for Monterrey, that could be, worth it.
It's almost, it's such Mexico is in such a unique situation in that regard, because I think people in Europe don't appreciate how good of a league it actually is and how big some of these clubs are. If you want to know how big some of these clubs are, just Google Monterrey Stadium and look it up. Because that would be a world-class stadium in most European leagues. But the issue, of course, is that Liga MX, because it is such a good league, because the salaries are competitive to big European leagues, they don't have. MLS is an emerging league. The fact is still, though, that you look at the CONCACAF Champions Cup is still predominantly won by Mexican teams. They don't have the grind of having to face, like if you were playing in Germany for a top team, you would also play Champions League or Europa League, right? And that just adds another level to your game. And I think that is one thing that's maybe missing a little bit in Mexico. That's almost that really weird situation that you have an European level league without the European competition outside of your league.
Yes, and now that you said this, I remember a special case that I think could be a cool comparison with the Mexican league. That it's Obed Vargas, because Obed Vargas was also like a promised kid from Mexico, but also playing in the U.S. And they decided, Seattle decided to sold him, I think, around of 3 million. to Atletico de Madrid. And if Obed Vargas were in the Mexican League, I'm pretty sure that they
Yeah.
wanted to sell him maybe around of 10 million. So I think that's a big difference that we need to take care of it. And also, to maybe, I expect that the negotiations between Tijuana and other teams regarding Gilberto Mora could be maybe looking for the future, maybe earning more money in a next sale or something like this. Because if we decide to keep him next maybe 1 or 2 more seasons, I think we could stop his development that he already has shown.
I mean, that was a really important thing in the Obed Vargas sale from Seattle Sounders to Atletico Madrid, that there is mechanisms in that transfer that will guarantee Seattle a lot of money down the road, but they have the patience to wait, right?
Exactly.
And they did it because there was gentleman's agreement with the player to ensure that his long-term development is guaranteed. And of course, he's a really fascinating prospect for Mexico as well, although born in Alaska Anchorage, Alaska.
I know.
So, and I mean, the same is true for Brian Gutierrez, who was developed by the Chicago Fire. He was born in Illinois, right? So there is good talent there. It just happens to be born across the border in the United States. So I think Mexico is such a fascinating case. Gilberto Mora is a fully grown and developed Mexican talent, and a player who I think everyone should be paying attention to. Everyone should be paying attention to the market value update as well. That's on our side. And thank you so much again, Osvaldo, for providing fantastic quotes. And thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Emmanuel, and all for all your audience and for all the conversation. It was pretty interesting. I think we can talk more about this, but let's talk about this in another episode.
We definitely will have you back. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Manuel.
We're well and truly into market value season here at Transfermarkt. Manu and Osvaldo just broke through all the biggest talking points in Mexico, and to my clear delight, I am back in Glasgow, my hometown, with Ewan to discuss the Scottish market values. Ewan, not as sunny, maybe not as bright, but just as dramatic, I'm sure, after what was a title decider this weekend in the Scottish Premiership, sorry, my apologies.
Yeah, it couldn't have been any more dramatic in terms of coming down to the final day and coming down to the final 10 minutes. And obviously, being Scotland, we know how the media works up here. The commentaries have been dominated by, off-field stuff and conspiracies ever since. So it's nice to be talking about football again and the players involved.
Yeah, absolutely. For anyone who missed it, Celtic and Hearts played one another at Celtic Park on Saturday to basically decide who wins the league title, and Celtic came out 3-1 winners and picked up another league title. Now, Ewan, a lot of people would probably think this market value update, which is now out live for people who are listening to the show, it's up on our website, would be dominated by Hearts due to the fact that they've obviously done very well this season, and perhaps due to Celtic, who obviously went on and won the league title. But the reason I wanted to have you on the show this week is because rather than talking about Celtic, Hearts, Rangers, Aberdeen, etc., what's actually really driven the market values in this market value update is actually the demand for so many kind of key players at clubs up and down the Scottish top flight. It's not usually something we get to talk about with Scottish football. It's known for its passion. It's known for the old firm, obviously. It's known for all sorts, huge amount of history, but it's not always a league that's known for developing talent. But we've actually outlined 5 players that we want to go through here who've all had market value updates, and that's largely due to the fact that all 5 of them could end up leaving their respective clubs and moving on to England, Spain, wherever this summer. So I'll jump straight into it. The first one is Motherwell centre forward Tawanda Maswanhise. A revelation, Ewan, this season for the Steelman. He's picked up, I've got it in front of me, 22 goals and 2 assists in 44 games. His market value in this market value update rose from 3.5 million to 5 million euros. And just to kind of underline how impressive he's been this season, his market value at the start of the season was just 450k. Obviously, for anyone who hasn't been following Scottish football this season, Ewan, or perhaps has been but hasn't been keeping an eye on Motherwell, what can you tell us about Maswanhise and why he's so special, and perhaps what might happen to him this summer in the transfer window?
Yeah, perfectly introduced when you said he's been a revelation, because that's exactly what he has been. Credit must go to Motherwell and Nick Dawes and the recruitment team there, because they rely heavily on data, and they've had an exceptional season, and it's been driven by the manager, who could be on the move this summer, but also the players they brought in, and the striker Maswanhise has had an incredible season, 22 goals. It's also a wee side note that he went away with Zimbabwe for the African Cup of Nations, so he did miss games, so that could have been higher. But he's an incredible season to score that many goals. He's going to dominate the headlines around Motherwell Football Club. And in terms of his market value, it has rose like exponentially this season. But there's a reason for that. It's our understanding that there was serious interest in the player in January that Motherwell rebuffed. Ultimately, that proved to be the correct decision, because they've qualified for European football qualifiers next season. And he's also retained his value, and not only that, in our opinion, his value has increased due to the fact that he's kind of maintained his form. He's finished with a really, really good goal output, and there's a lot of interest in him. Actually, in Scotland, when a player from outside the old firm does well, they get linked to Celtic and Rangers. Now, that can be for accurate reasons, or because it can be it sells papers and get clicks to certain websites. But there was huge speculation linked into both Celtic and Rangers in the January window, and Motherwell are quite a strong position when it comes to being able to obtain a fee from this summer. There's no overwhelming pressure to sell. Motherwell are one of the provincial clubs. I don't like saying that, but they are one of the clubs in Scotland away from the big two who have had a very good record at selling players. Numerous players. David Turnbull went for good money just last summer. Lennon Miller went to Udinese for a big fee. So I think Motherwell are in a strong position to go and demand what they want from this summer, and I think that will be around about the €5 million mark.
Yeah, absolutely. That is such a crucial thing when it comes to player market values. Ceiling, if you will, a glass ceiling that can often be, or that is often implemented when they're at a club that don't sell players very well. And I know that may sound silly, because we all think of market values and we think of transfer fees being astronomical. But when you deal with leagues like the Scottish Premiership, there are clubs that are very good at selling players, and there are clubs that aren't very good at selling players. And Motherwell are one of the clubs that are getting better at that. And as such, very comfortable putting up Maswanhise's market value to €5 million, because Motherwell have shown a capacity to sell players for that kind of money. But yeah, as you're right, linked with Rangers, Anderlecht, and of course some clubs in Saudi Arabia as well. So yeah, Motherwell might be cashing in on his fantastic talents this summer. Another one, Ewan, outside of Celtic and Rangers, Claudio Braga, another centre forward. Player who's done very, very well for Hearts, 17 goals and 6 assists for Hearts this season. His market value rose to €7 million from €6 million in this market value update. One of the star players in that that Hearts team, who ultimately finished second, but they still did something historic there, splitting the Glasgow Giants, of course. And even though they didn't win a league title, still a season to remember, and a season that Claudio Braga can look back on with a huge bit of pride.
Yeah, massively. Also got an incredible song that went viral at the start of the season. That also had nothing to do with his market value update, but from an individual point of view, he also picked up the PFA Player of the Year in Scotland. He also picked up the Football Writers Player of the Year as well, and hugely justified for his impact on this Hearts team. So much has been written about Tony Bloom's recruitment model and Jamestown Analytics, and Braga has been the biggest diamond that they've unearthed in the summer. Plucked from the Norwegian second tier. Wasn't much known about him when he joined, but he's had an incredible season. 23 goal contributions. Really key player for Hearts in that attacking area. Him and Lawrence Shankland were probably the main reason why they were able to put up such a spirited title bid, and they finished the highest ever points total in the Scottish top flight. So incredible season for Hearts, and Braga's a player who, in my personal view, should define what Hearts need to do moving forward to close the gap to Celtic and Rangers. We talked earlier about how Motherwell have a track record of being able to flip players for good fees. Hearts haven't been able to do that. Their record at selling players is abysmal, to be honest. And I think that's an area where Tony Bloom has obviously identified for huge growth, and for them to ultimately maintain their success this season and edge away at that gap between Celtic and Rangers. The key pivotal area for them is the transfer market. That is where they're going to get their rewards. You've seen what Tony Bloom's been able to do with Brighton in terms of unearth players from the South American market, for example, with Moises Caicedo and Alexis McAllister. Just a couple of examples. There's been so many at Brighton, and be able to flip them for huge profits. That's what Hearts need to do. They're not going to be able to match with Celtic and Rangers in terms of commercial income, match day income. They could really close the gap in terms of being able to flip players. And I think realistically, and Hearts fans might not like me to say this, that they should look to cash in on Claudio Braga this summer.
Yeah, curiously, he's linked to Celtic, as you said, Crystal Palace and Brighton, who, as we all know, Tony Bloom also part of the Tony Bloom extended universe, if you will. So it'll be interesting to see if he does swap Edinburgh for Brighton this summer. Another one who we have to keep an eye on, another forward as well, Youssef Chermiti, the Rangers striker. Ewan, a player who very much seems to be Everton's loss has been Rangers' gain in the last kind of 12 months or so. His market value has shot back up to 15 million euros. Only Everton for a very short period of time, but in his time at Rangers, he's proved to be very, very useful to them. 15 goals and 5 assists in 41 games. Some big goals in big games for Rangers, perhaps most notably, if people are maybe looking at that goal scoring record and thinking it's not a huge amount to sing about for a Rangers player. But yeah, big games, big moments, and most recently linked with moves to Porto and PSV in the summer. We've pushed his market value up to 15 million euros. Do you want to maybe expand on why that's the case?
Yeah, that's what might have raised eyebrows, because like you said, people look at his numbers and his output and go, that's not remarkable for a player at one of the big clubs in Scotland in a league which has a lot of detractors. But just in terms of Chermiti, it's more about his profile and also the market. There's not a abundance of centre forwards. It's a position in football which is kind of changed so much over recent years that you don't really get that out and out number 9. So if you're looking at Chermiti's profile, he's 6'2", 3, 4 perhaps. I should probably know that off the top of my head. He's a big player. Physically, he's really impressive. His strength is one of his best traits. He's also quite quick. So he has all the attributes you'd want from a target man. And you've got to remember, he's still a young player. He's not been exposed to a lot of minutes at senior football. Like you mentioned, he didn't really play at Everton. He had a lot of injury problems. Sporting on it with a huge reputation in Portugal. It just didn't work out for him there. And you see it all the time. It's the hardest league in the world to kind of cut your teeth at, especially as an attacking player with the physicality, and a lot of teams kind of adopting a more kind of defensive approach than other top European leagues. So to look at Chermiti, it's his profile in a position where there is a real dearth of quality. He is young. He's a Portugal under-21 international. I think there was maybe around the kind of March international break a hope within some at Rangers that he could even get a senior call-up during that window, which would have obviously been massive for him as a player. But there's a huge market, I think, for him this summer. There was links to Fenerbahce in January, which were kind of rubbished in Turkey, but that doesn't always mean that the interest wasn't there. There's been links to Porto, there's been links to PSV, and it's our understanding at Transfermarkt there is significant interest in the player across Europe this summer. And if he is to go, then I think 15 million euros would probably be on the lower side of things, but we've got to weigh it up against numerous factors when we consider market values.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly seems as though he's done a great job in quickly turning his career around after a bit of a hiccup at Everton, and I'm sure very few people hold that against him when they're considering a player of his profile and looking for a centre forward this summer. Another player who did swap one of Europe's top leagues for the Scottish Premiership next on our list is Arne Engels, the Celtic midfielder. He has kept his spot, Ewan, as the most valuable player in the Scottish top flight. He's moved from 18 million euros to 20 million euros. Obviously part of that title-winning team for Celtic. 14 goals and assists in 45 games for Celtic. And perhaps a perfect example of what we're talking about here, where we're talking about players that are in demand. Not only has Engels been linked with moves to Lazio and Dortmund in recent months, but there was very clear interest in January, and we suspect that there probably be something similar in the summer transfer window.
Yeah, and we had that conundrum just after the January window when we looked at it, and Nottingham Forest submitted bids in excess, the whole package of them in excess of, I think it was 23 million euros. There's obviously so many factors at play when we look at market values, but that was a deadline day. They submitted a few bids, so there was an element of it was late in the window. I'm not going to say desperation, because clubs don't spend in excess of 20 million euros on a player when they're desperate, but that probably had a little factor in his market value back then. But he deserves to go up. There's been huge interest from Europe, and Arne Engels, he's played in the Bundesliga. Again, his profile, he's a good age. He's a midfielder that can play a number of roles in there. I mean, again, when we look at Celtic's history, they do have history of flipping players for fees and well in advance of 20 million euros. I think maybe a good side point for Arne Engels will be Matt O'Reilly. Now, I don't think Engels will get the same fee that O'Reilly did, which was just under 30 million euros. But he is a player, midfielder, can score goals. There's huge interest in him, and I'd imagine that he could be on the move this summer. I think Celtic were right not to sell him in January, because they couldn't at that point in the season. They were, unfancied in the title race, and ultimately he's played a role in them winning the title. So, yeah, I think a very, very good player, Arne Engels. Again, he's split opinion in Scotland, but I think that's more to do with his style. He's kind of a languid player. He's not a guy that's going to run about 100 miles an hour and smash into tackles. But a really talented footballer, and there's definitely a market for him.
Yeah, he's one of those kind of curious players, and this often happens at Celtic Rangers, where they're maybe not the most technically gifted, so they're maybe a wee bit overlooked, but then they end up in somewhere like the Premier League, and then they end up being very useful kind of workhorses, if you will. Someone like Ryan Christie or Stuart Armstrong comes to mind in that regard. And it's also worth bearing in mind that Celtic, despite winning the title, will almost certainly be making a huge overhaul of that squad, so they'll probably need to sell players to finance some new deals. Another player who, and finally the last player in this list actually, is a player who could go for a very similar fee to Arne Engels, and that is Emmanuel Fernandez, the Rangers defender. Probably the biggest market value increase, not just of this market value update, Ewan, but maybe of the entire season. Fernandez, was 350,000 euros was the market value at the start of the season, and it's now sitting high on 18 million euros. And it might seem a bit odd to people who don't follow Scottish football as to why this player has gained, 17.65 million euros off the top of my head in transfer fees, market value this season. But let me just list some of the clubs that have been linked to him since the start of the year, actually. We have Dortmund, we have Leverkusen, Ajax, Everton, West Ham, Club Brugge, Chelsea, and Arsenal. This is a player who, which is worth bearing in mind that obviously Rangers didn't really do as well as they maybe hoped to. But from an individual point of view, Ewan, very few can kind of rival Fernandez in the way that he has not only developed as a player, but attracted interest from elsewhere.
Yeah, again, people from the outside might look at this and go, how's a player at Rangers who finished third in the Scottish Premiership increased by near enough 18 million euros in the season? But again, it's like we talked about with Chermiti. First of all, his profile, physically imposing centre back, strong, quick, very comfortable on the ball, albeit he can be guilty of lapses of concentration at times. But I think Fernandez has the profile and the skill set to thrive at a big top five league football club. It's no surprise there's been interest in him. Top clubs in Germany have watched him. There's always interest in the Premier League before he moved to Rangers. Everton were interested in him as well, so he's on the radar of these clubs. And again, we look at the fees that those clubs pay for centre backs. We look at what Rangers would want ideally in the market. for Emmanuel Fernandez, and I think €18 million is a good ballpark for what he could go for in the summer. I think he is a player that could move in the summer. It's also worth pointing out that he made his debut for Nigeria this season as well. Just all in all, listen, from a personal point of view, I really, really like him as a player. I think he can go to become a top player in the Premier League, the Bundesliga, Serie A. I think he has, the raw skill set to thrive in these leagues. And we know how important defenders are with the physicality and the pace. I can see him going in the summer for maybe even in excess of €18 million. There's still obviously elements of his game he needs to work on. He's still quite raw with some of the things he does, but I think he's a player who we'll be talking a lot about this summer.
Yeah, absolutely. And a London lad as well. So
yeah,
presumably would, fill some of those kind of quotas in the Premier League as well for homegrown players. But that's all we have there. And, it's going to be really interesting, Ewan, to see how many of these players do move on. Some people might be watching this video right now in, June, July, August after their club signed one of these players, wanting to know who Arne Engels is, who Claudio Braga is, who Emmanuel Fernandez is. And that's partly why I enjoy doing these market values so much. Not so much just doing the market values of the most valuable players in the world. It's also about unearthing these young talents in the smaller leagues around the world as well. And market values are a great way of kind of gauging the up-and-coming players and the potential stars of tomorrow. But Ewan, that's all the time we have. I'm sure we'll have you back on the show to talk about all things British football and elsewhere. But until then, I'll speak to you soon.
Cheers. Thanks for having me.